Welcome to Module 3 of the MELI Unit's Strategic Planning course. In this module, we will introduce you to key concepts of objectives and indicators, including the difference between goals and objectives, how indicators help us measure objectives, and what makes a good indicator. Let's get started. As we discussed in our Theories of Change module, a goal is a broad statement about the long-term expectation of what should happen as a result of your program. For example, we might want to increase the number of college graduates who speak foreign languages critical to national security. Alternatively, an objective is a change the program will need to accomplish in order to reach the desired goal. For example, deepen participants' understanding of the national security landscape, advance participants' cultural competence and global perspective, and strengthen the personal, professional, and technical aptitudes of participants are all examples of objectives. A goal is what you want to achieve. And objectives are how you will achieve it. While programs typically only have one goal, they often have multiple objectives. Let's look at this visually. At the top, we have our goal statement. And under that, we have our supporting objectives. Under any given goal, you might only have one objective, or you can have a few. There's more to this hierarchy, and we'll get into that throughout the rest of this module. How do we assess progress toward our established goals and objectives? We use performance indicators. Performance indicators are measures of change for the results that a program is aiming to achieve. Now let's go back to this visual. We have our goals and objectives, under which we have our indicators. Every objective should be measured by at least one indicator, but you can use as many as you need. Now let's look at different kinds of indicators. First, we have output indicators. These are the product of an activity, and they do not measure change. An example might be the number of hours of language instruction. Then we have outcome indicators. These are measures of the extent to which a project objective is being achieved, and they do measure change. For example, the percent of participants reporting an increase in language skills as a result of their program participation. It is common for people to get mixed up between outcomes and outputs, and the best test of that is control. If it is the product of a program activity that sits squarely within the control of that activity, it is likely an output. If it describes a change and is one or more steps removed from the program's control, it is likely an outcome. So, going back to our example of language instruction, the number of hours of language training is an output because it sits squarely within the control of program implementation through the program's activities. The program can decide how many hours of instruction to provide and work to ensure those hours are conducted. When it comes to a change in the participant's language skills acquired by the participant, though, that is a step removed because while the program can be designed to give the best chance for language acquisition, that really comes down to the participant's actions. They have to have the willingness, motivation, and capacity to learn. So it would be an outcome. As we discussed in our logic model module, there are different types of change that our outcome indicators can measure. Let's dive into those a little bit more. So in no particular order, we'll start with changing attitudes. which is when we are reinforcing or shifting an idea, perception, belief, or feeling held by participants. Then we have changing behaviors, which is when we are reinforcing or shifting the way in which participants act. Next is organizational partnerships, which is when we are helping participants to establish or strengthen a relationship between institutions or a group of institutions. These partnerships are situated institutionally rather than personally, and they can be between many different types of institutions. Next up is increasing awareness, which is when we are increasing participants' knowledge around an idea or specific information. Then we have relationship building, which is when we are helping participants to establish or strengthen relationships between people or groups of people. These relationships may be between U.S. government staff and a foreign public, between people in the United States and another country, or between foreign publics. And lastly is knowledge or skill building, which is when we seek to improve participants' ability to understand and emulate or adopt skills that are taught during a program. But what makes a good indicator? You can't just write an indicator and hope for the best. There are guidelines you have to follow to help ensure your indicators will produce useful data. This is where SMART comes in. We start with specific. The indicator should clearly outline what you are trying to measure. While the outcome or result itself can be broad, the indicator should be narrow and focus on the who and what of the intervention. Next is measurable. The indicator should have the capacity to be counted, observed, analyzed, or tested. If you cannot measure an indicator, then progress cannot be determined. Once an indicator is clear and specific, they can be measured in numerous ways. At the end of the day, almost any indicator in one way or another is measurable, assuming it is also specific. Next is achievable. The indicator should be realistically achievable in the time frame you have set for yourself. The indicator is achievable if the target accurately specifies the amount or level of what is to be measured in order to meet the result or outcome. Next is relevant. The indicator should have a clear connection to the program's goals. The best way to think about relevance is to ensure that there is a relationship between what the indicator measures and the theories that help create the outcomes for the client, program, or system. Essentially, you want to make sure that your indicators are directly connected to your theory of change or logic model. And lastly is time-bound or timely. The indicator should specify the time frame in which it will be measured, and that time frame should make sense given the length of the program. Now, let's look at some examples, starting with specific. Consider the indicator number of youth who pass the exam. This is not a specific indicator for a couple of reasons. First, how are we defining youth? And second, what does it mean to pass the exam? Whereas the indicator number of youth, 15 to 18, who receive 90% or more on the language proficiency exam specifies both what we mean by youth, ages 15 to 18, and what passing the exam means, receiving a score of 90% or more. Now let's look at measurable. Consider the indicator number of American students studying Arabic. A couple of issues are likely to come up when trying to measure this indicator. First, what population are we concerned with? If we're looking at all Americans throughout the entire country, how are we going to get that number? And second, what counts as studying? Are we looking at college majors? Are we only looking at a specific class at a certain level? What are we looking at here? A more measurable version might be percent of program alumni who continue to study Arabic 1 year after program completion. Now let's look at achievable. Consider the indicator percent of alumni who express interest in national security careers. Initially, we set a baseline of 20% and a target of 90%. Realistically, going from 20 to 90% probably isn't an achievable goal. But if we revise our target to 30%, then we are being much more realistic about what we can achieve with this indicator. Now let's look at relevant. Consider a Russian language program for American high school students. The indicator, number of Americans traveling to Russia, isn't going to be relevant to this program because increasing travel to Russia is, let's assume, probably not a measure of success for this program. On the other hand, the indicator percent of program participants who show increased Russian proficiency measures a direct outcome for this program, making it much more relevant. And finally, let's look at time bound. Consider the indicator percent of alumni who stay in touch with their host families. This is a great indicator, but we have no sense of when it should be measured. So we add a time frame. Percent of alumni who are still in touch with their host families after 6 months. Aside from SMART, here are a few other questions you may want to consider when developing your indicators. What do you need to tell your stakeholders about your program? What do you need for yourself in order to know if your program is meeting its goals and objectives? Will the indicator be useful for decision making? And finally, is the indicator worth the management and financial resources required to collect and analyze the indicator data? And lastly, when developing your indicators, remember to have clear definitions in the indicator or as a corresponding resource. Indicators should be reliable across contexts and time periods, and indicators should not be viewed in a vacuum. Other factors may play a role, including economic conditions, the political landscape, and really a number of other concerns. So that's it for our module on objectives and indicators. And when you're ready, you can head back to the training overview and move on to Module 4 on performance monitoring plans.